Hi, welcome to the UK Evaluation Society is hosting a wonderful talk from Howard White from the Global Development Network. We've got quite a lot of people joining. We're going to give people another minute or two before we introduce. So I'll just give everyone another minute as people are still joining the call before we start. For those of you who are just joining, we're just giving everybody a minute or so to get onto the call. We're up to 130 participants now, so we'll just give everybody another couple of minutes, and then we'll get, or another sort of 30 seconds or so, and we'll get started. Right, okay, we're up to 130, coming up to 140 participants. So let's get going. Otherwise, we'll not make the best use of the time. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon over your lunch break. This is really exciting opportunity. My name is Kirsty Shiffers, and I am the newly appointed president of the UK Evaluation Society. I quickly want to point out Nick Cosford, who is our even more newly appointed executive director of the society. And we're really excited to be hosting or co-hosting this talk with the Global Development Network and have Howard come and speak to us about common flaws in evaluation. And before we do that, I'll just do a brief bit of housekeeping. Professor Howard White will be introducing himself and going into his talk and probably talking for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time for discussion. If you do have questions, please put questions in the Q&A. The chat is not uh, used for this particular presentation, and myself and Nick will do our best to kind of moderate and get those questions over to Howard in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll have some options for people to be able to actually ask the questions themselves. So hopefully the hand raising function will be possible for that, but we'll see how that goes. Just to take a brief moment to introduce you to the UK Evaluation Society, and just so you know what's going on. There's quite a lot in this slide that to bring up, but it's just to quickly do a little bit of advertising for a principal organisation for professionals in the field of evaluation in the UK. And we've got a range of objectives. We want to promote the value of evaluation, strengthen aspects of evaluation practice, encourage and support innovation, protect and promote principles of EDI, and engage in ethical practice. If you are interested in becoming a member, if you're not already, we do offer a range of events, professional developments, and opportunities for sharing experiences. We have a conference coming up in May 2025, which will follow on from our extremely successful conference from a few months ago. And very finally, we have This year is excitingly the 30th year of the UK Evaluation Society. So we've got a really great range of events coming up this year that are focusing on the past, present and future of evaluation, with a particularly special event in November at a world famous location in Cardiff. So that's enough from me. I will stop sharing my screen now, but please do get in touch with us if you would like to hear more about what we do. So without further ado, I will pass over to Professor Howard White, who I'm really excited to hear from, and I'll hear what you say about common flaws in evaluation. Thanks, Howard.
Okay, thank you very much, Kristin, for the introduction, and thank you to UK Evaluation Society for co-hosting this event with the Global Development Network. GGN is an international organisation based in Delhi, in India, whose mission is to support developing country research in doing policy-relevant research. And I head the Evaluation Evidence Synthesis Programme at GGN, and as some of you may know, I've worked in evaluation for well over 30 years now, first as a researcher, then the World Bank, then at 3IE, then the Campbell Collaboration working on reviews, and then more recently at GGN directly. And my work has been focused mainly on what we call international development, but work in Africa and Asia. And I will draw on some examples from those situations. But since I started working at Campbell, which is getting on for 10 years ago now, I also work on what we call domestic interventions or intervention in developed countries, particularly in the United Kingdom, and I'll draw a bit on those examples. So I got moved by a piece of work I was doing to write a blog some months ago called 10 Common Flaws in Evaluation, and called 10 Common Flaws in Evaluation, and UKES approached us asking, could you perhaps do an event around this, generate a lot of interest. So perhaps just basically do a presentation when you read out the blog, or maybe, because that wouldn't take quite so long, where I elaborate on some of the points. So that's what I'm going to do in this presentation. I want to make clear that these are flaws, but I do see really quite often, I read a lot of evaluations, we do a lot of evidence maps, schematic reviews, which requires to read a lot of studies. And so I do come across these flaws quite frequently, but it's by no means that all evaluations have these flaws. There's some really, really good evaluations out there, and it's very rewarding and satisfying when you find a good evaluation and it doesn't have these flaws, and they can be very rich and provide a lot of useful information. There's a principle in qualitative research called the saturation principle, which basically says, being applied to doing interviews and focus groups and so on, if you do 6, then you won't identify any more themes or issues arising out of doing any more than that. And it's certainly true that if you find a really good evaluation report on a topic, that can take you a long way to understanding it. And you need to read from some other, for doing a review, read from some other contexts and settings and so on. But if you get a handful, half a dozen of really rich evaluations, then you're very well set in the qualitative part of doing a review. Anyway, let's move on to the chat. Feel free to tweet. I don't think there's actually a hashtag for this event, but both GGN and UKES are on Twitter, of course. And so do feel free to tweet from the event. And I'll try and go slowly enough for you to do that and point out tweetable moments as we go. You'll find me under Howard N. White in Twitter. So the first common flaw is what I call missing beginnings. So for those of you working with theories of change, you may well be familiar with the missing middle, which is a concept that came from me, though not many people do know that, from work I was doing with David Booth on different country evaluation strategies back in the early 2000s. So in the late 1990s, with the new Labour government, there was a big shift in aid policy to try and be more focused on the poor. It actually began a bit earlier under the Tories, that shift, but it got reinforced with the Labour government. And so the different country programmes were required to write these new country strategy papers, and David Booth and I asked to do a review of them. And we identified this problem called the missing middle. It was actually picked up by the International Development Select Committee in the UK, who used this term, the missing middle, for their the Sixth Select Committee report. And the problem of the missing middle was that basically the CSPs listed all the different programs they were doing in a country, like say Zambia, and those same programs they'd been doing 2 years earlier, but the previous country strategy papers had not mentioned poverty or mentioned passing. And I remember the Zambia once I worked on it, and it went from something like 7 mentions of poverty to 139 mentions of poverty. But the program was identical, hadn't changed. It's just now, okay, we're relabeling this program as poverty focused. So they brought in all these new outcomes that weren't there before around poverty and malnutrition and learning and so on. But actually, there was no theory of change. This is over 20 years ago, so theories of change were not as ubiquitous as they are these days. There was no theory of change linking how we're doing this is going to lead to that. So it came to the term missing middle. And theories of change have become quite common. So you might not see the missing middle so much, but a lot of theories of change focus on the upper end. They say, okay, we're going to produce maybe these outputs like I mentioned, but they're much more focused on the outcomes. So intermediate outcomes, longer run outcomes, what's often called impact, though I'm aware of using that term because of debate on impact evaluation. So they focus on that level, and they don't really focus on what's going on in the project, which to me is where the real theory of change action is happening. Is the project doing what it's meant to be doing? What was it meant to be doing? And so on. And so you get really an inadequate description, if any, of the intervention. And so that's missing beginning. So you don't actually know what the intervention is. And that means that the evaluations have 2 functions, lesson learning and accountability. And definitely the lesson learning function is just knocked out totally by missing beginnings. Because here you say, oh, this works. What works? Oh, we didn't tell you. So as a program manager, I say, oh, that one. I'm thinking in particular of a report I read of intervention for people experiencing homelessness in a city in the UK. And it concluded the interventions work, and nowhere described what the interventions being in the city were. So any program manager elsewhere reading wants to learn, well, what should we do? What worked in that place? Will not know, because there was no description of interventions. And when you're doing systematic reviews, then you want to know, is this a similar intervention to that intervention? Does it meet our inclusion criteria? What actually did they do? Back when I worked at the World Bank, we do these the operations part do these self-evaluations called implementation completion results reports, and they are basically process evaluations, and they're all validated. They all get checked for the ratings by the evaluation department. So I would what's called independent evaluation group. So every staff member gets handed a pile of these. You do like a dozen or so a year, and I would read them and think, you spent $25 million or $50 million, $100 million. What did you spend it on? Please just tell me. And they might list some components, technical assistance, capacity building for government, support to child development to be a component. What was actually done to that component? No idea, not from reading the completion report. So this problem missing beginning is a real problem. And there is a tendency also, partly because of the results agenda, which I'll come back to. I'm going to criticize the results agenda a lot in this talk. Partly because of the results report, results agenda, you get these what are called outcome evaluations, where they simply track the outcomes in the program areas. These are not evaluations. These have no evaluative content whatsoever. They're monitoring reports. And because they're monitoring higher level outcomes, they're actually useless. So there can be some value in knowing about monitoring high level outcomes. I'm not going to talk about that in this particular talk. I've written about it elsewhere, but it is not evaluation. So outcome monitoring alone is particularly unuseful. And these so-called outcome evaluations, which become very common because results just tell you nothing at all about the intervention. I did a review of the different results system for NAO, performance management system for NAO, again over 20 years ago. And that was the main problem, was they had no bottom-up project management-based system at that time, and any reporting they had was based on what were then the IDTs, it became the MDGs, the SDGs, and that's just useless from the point of view of managing an organization. And that was embodied in the service delivery agreements at the time. It's just not an appropriate way to learn about the impact of what you're doing. So this brings us, this point continues, because a point I make very frequently and continue to make, of the second problem of monitoring passing as evaluation. So one manifestation of that is outcome evaluations. So that's just monitoring of outcomes. It's not an evaluation. But you also get so-called evaluation reports, which take the same step approach down to output level. So the example I give in the blog is on youth employment, where I was looking particularly at careers services in youth employment, and quite a lot of interventions supported by ILO and UNDP support careers development services, often university-based. Youth employment programs across Africa are generally oriented towards graduates, and so they put a career service into universities. It might have some outreach to secondary schools, and that was what you would be told, that, oh, there were 4 university careers offices opened, and if you're lucky, it might say the number of students that utilize that service over a certain time period. It might say there's outreach activity in a certain number of secondary schools. All this is counting. All this is counting numbers. I'm an econometrician. I'm not against numbers, but just simply recording the outputs that were produced, that's not evaluation. That's monitoring again. And so you've got monitoring passing as evaluation. It's not evaluation. To be evaluation needs to be evaluative content, which is making evaluative judgments about what would normally be process evaluations. So this diagram, very simplified diagram of this very simplified theory of change, says, look, process evaluation wants to know about the process. In Scriven's excellent definition, his Encyclopedia of Evaluation says, the evaluand in a process evaluation is not the outcomes, it's the intervention. So you're evaluating the intervention, the way it was designed, the way it's implemented. You want to know how that went. And so you're not looking at the evaluand being outcomes like an impact evaluation, you're looking actually at the intervention as a subject of interest. So you want to, career services were set up. What was the ownership by the university? How well were they? What was the outreach that was done to university students to let them know about the service? What was the training given to the people providing career service and advice? What information access they had to labour market information in which to base that advice? There are lots of questions around career guidance and how well it works. That should be asked in the evaluation. Simply saying there was a career guidance is created is just, it's telling me very little. Okay, good. It's better than it not being created, but it's telling me very little of use from an evaluative point of view. So how are we going to evaluate what we how the intervention went? Now the problem is that and this is a really common problem. So it's a problem in the vast majority of evaluations. I was asked by an international organisation, one of the UN organisations, to do a review of their evaluations and to come to a conclusion about what you could say about causal evidence from those evaluations about the impact of the ILO. Oh, sorry, I forget the name. Why from the UN organisation, the ILO supported interventions. And I'm not against making causal claims based on qualitative analysis. I've got papers and a new paper coming out on small n impact evaluation, so it can be done. But of the over 100 evaluations we looked at, only 7 actually had any methods. The others didn't have any methods. They were methods-free evaluations. So when I went back to I said, I can't do what you're asking because the vast majority of these studies have no explicit methods. So I cannot have any confidence in the study findings. So a key idea in systematic reviews is we do what's called critical appraisal. And the critical appraisal is basically, here's a finding. It can be a quantitative finding or a qualitative finding. How confident am I in that finding? It's a really important concept. So evaluations make evidence claims. There might be causal claims about this caused that to happen, the intervention had this effect on the outcome. But they might also be claims about the intervention didn't reach the intended target group because there was insufficient outreach, because the intervention took place in the wrong time and place, because transport costs were too high for people to reach intervention, whatever. These are evaluative findings of use and interest to decision makers. And so when someone makes that claim, you want to know, well, how confident can I be in that particular finding, that evidence claim? And so we use critical appraisal to assess that. And the key point about critical appraisal is basically how good were the methods, and that means what was the conduct and reporting of the methods. So often you get studies that might not be bad studies, that they're badly reported studies, but often they are bad studies. So here's a couple of examples of typical descriptions of methodology. So a sample survey will be conducted at firm in Addis Ababa, the firm will be identified, blah, 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 blah. Here's a second one for reproductive health intervention. Focus group discussion with key groups such as youth, mums with young children, and key informed interviews, blah, blah, blah. Data analysed with in vivo. Okay, there's actually a lot wrong with these. You could take these as for essay questions in the evaluation exam and say just what's wrong with these. But from my point of view, the key thing wrong with these, a sample survey is not a method. It's how you're going to collect your data. Mixed methods is not a method. I see quite a lot of people raising their hands. We're not taking questions during the talk. Please put questions for now into the Q&A, not into the chat. And if you can't hear, please put that for some reason. Please put that into the Q&A quite urgently, and one of the moderators will see it and try and sort out whatever problem there is. Mixed methods are not a method. What methods are you mixing? If you say I'm using mixed methods, you might as well say I'm using methods. Yeah, okay. We haven't told what they are, so I have no idea if they're good methods or not. And finally, I can't stick to the bar. And finally, SPS is not a method. Naming your software, Stata, R, SPSS, Excel, whatever, it's not a method. In vivo, it's not a method. Okay, it's the statistical tool you're going to use to analyze your data. So the evaluation design, I'd much rather use the word evaluation design than methods. Evaluation design has two components: the data you're going to analyze and how you're going to analyze them. The second of those, means of analysis, is the method. And it can be very simple. It can be descriptive statistics. It can be thematic analysis using an inductive iterative approach. It can be various things that can use. And data collection has two parts. One is the sampling strategy, so who you're going to ask, who you're going to collect data from. And the other is the means of data collection. Is it a structured sample survey? Is it a semi-structured survey? Is it focus groups? Is it some other participatory method? So all of those three components, who you're going to collect the data from and how you're going to identify them, how you're going to collect the data, then how you're going to analyze those data, that's the evaluation design. And as I've said, most evaluations don't have that. Under their methods sections, when they have one, which most do, they describe this. Oh, our method is a sample survey. Our method is a focus group discussion. It's not a method. It's how you're going to collect your data or who you're going to collect your data from. That's not the means of analysis. So there's a lot of methods-free evaluations out there, and that undermines basically everything, because it undermines accountability, it undermines lesson learning. Because we have no idea whatsoever or what confidence we can have in those study findings. So that does bring me to this. These are two separate points I've combined into one. I've shown me the evidence. So it's very common to see unsubstantiated and undersubstantiated evidence claims in evaluation reports. So it would not be uncommon to read a statement like, women were empowered by taking part in savings groups. That may be true. The evaluation may have the evidence to show that it's true, based on a particular evaluation design. But very often, this is all you get. So it's evaluative judgment, and I'm not shown the evidence to allow me to know whether I have confidence in that evaluative judgment or not. You've got to show me sufficient evidence for me to think, yes, okay, that finding is based on the data and analysis of the data using the methods you said you're going to use. I need to see that. So you've got to have some substantiation. So another finding: some young people said they felt more confident about what they could achieve after taking part in sports activities. I think that's probably true. We've done a review on sports activities. That's something that you find, but this alone does not allow me to make that judgment. So back when I started working at the World Bank, the founder of the evaluation department, Bob Picciotto, was still the Director General. And Bob hated sentences like this. He would always say, how many out of how many? Okay, how many young people out of how many young people spoke to? Even if it's qualitative data, and so you're not claiming a representative sample, though they might be, and you want to get some idea of, is this a representative statement or not? And it doesn't have to be. You can always argue by exceptionalism, and you want to identify the outliers and work according to the outliers. There are approaches that build on that, but you want to get some idea of what's the evidence base for this statement. Similarly, the provision of career guides undoubtedly help young people make better career choices. Here's just a leap of faith, and this is very common, where we measure the outputs, and that's as far as we got. Maybe we measure some intermediate outcomes, and that's as far as we got. And we just make a leap of faith to say, oh, well, that undoubtedly led to this. No, at least if we haven't got evidence for your own evaluation, at least refer to external evidence, preferably from systematic reviews, but from other evaluations, preferably in a similar context, where it was shown that this one thing led to the other thing. You can't just claim and this undoubtedly is a word an evaluator should never use. As an evaluator should have professional skepticism. It's not bias. Skepticism is not bias. It's just you have to always have be casting a critical eye on things to try and assess is that really so or not. Things are not as they necessarily appear. And that's particularly important because, next common flaw, there really are a lot of positive biases, particularly in qualitative evaluations. There are biases in quantitative evaluations, but we know what they are and they're recognized. So there might be sampling bias. We might have weak external validity of our sample not representative of the population as a whole we want to make an evidence claim for. We might have, most importantly, sample selection bias, which what randomization is intended to overcome. So there are always possible biases in quantitative that are there and we know about, and we generally describe them, with some exceptions. Differential attrition between treatment control groups, big problem, under-recognised. But generally, we recognise these issues. But there are many sources of bias in qualitative studies that are not recognised. And so one is basically having a focus on the intervention. So you go along and say, oh, hello, I'm working for the British Foreign Office doing evaluation of British support to your programme. We're considering whether the British should renew this programme and fund its organisation or not. So we're evaluating now. Do you think it was a good programme? What are they going to say? Okay, so that's been framed wrong. You've got all sorts of bias are going to come in there. And so you really should not be doing that. You should be asking, suppose the intervention is to increase the role of women in civil society. It's common intervention across a lot of agencies. And so you go in and you ask questions about, you're interested in the way in which the role of women has changed civil society over the last 10 years. And can you point specific changes that have taken place where the role of women in civil society has changed for the better or for the worse, or even where there's been no change also? And you document some of these changes, and then it sounds a bit like an outcome mapping approach, but it's not for various reasons, like we said, where it's got worse. And then you say, okay, what have been the main reasons that have driven those changes? What are the main drivers of change for women's role in civil society? And there's been no intervention here. If the intervention were what were playing a role, then they're going to mention it. If you go on for the standard hour, you do an interview for, and you've got to like 45 minutes, they're still talking about this, that, and the other, then you might say, well, actually, I'm interested in this particular set of activities supported by the British government. Then you start saying, are you aware of these? If an agency disciplinary support, whoever they are, what were those activities, what was done by that particular group, in what way that played a role in these changes? You move into areas where you might get biased responses, but then you should be aware of those biases. So where you frame the question, obviously courtesy bias when they know where you're from and that organisation has been supporting intervention in this area. Funding renewal bias when they know that you might funding decisions based on the outcomes of what you find in your evaluation. As a researcher, confirmation bias. I'm also prone to this. There's certain types of support I believe in compared to other types of support. Basically, I believe in things that give the money to the government, let the government get on with it, rather than donors trying to impose all sorts of conditions and controls on the money. But many people work on, say, women's groups. They believe that women's groups empower women. That's why I work in this space. But they go into the evaluation with strong priors. And so confirmation bias means we see and pick up and use evidence that meets what we believe, and we discard evidence that goes against what we believe. And we're hardwired to do that as human beings. So you've really got to try and find systematic ways to collect and analysing data, back to methods that allows you to overcome these sources of bias. That's why we do randomization to overcome selection bias. We've got to design methods to overcome these biases. So in cognitive psychology, there's what's called the fundamental attribution, because human beings, again, are hardwired to think, happened. There must be a reason for that. Stuff doesn't just happen for no reason. We always want to find a reason. And you go beyond this. If there's a good thing that happened, oh, that's because of us. We did that. If it's a bad thing, well, that was nothing to do with us. We're going to walk away, not our fault. So this fundamental attribution, again, it's something that's hardwired into us as human beings. So you've got to try and find evaluation approaches to overcome these biases. I'll talk about it later on. Then there's an evaluation, there's a contract renewal bias. If you're too negative about the organisation you're evaluating, they may not fund you again. Now, this varies by funder. I did it back in the 1990s. I did a lot of work with the Swedish government, SIDA. They love being criticised. Oh, we've been very bad. Tell us how bad we've been. Again, next contract comes straight away. With other organisations, particularly large multilateral organisation based in Europe, which hates to be criticised, and you will never get a penny out of them again should you dare to criticise them in your evaluations. It may not be always true, but it's many people have that experience. So you've got to think about these different biases and how you might overcome them. Oh, there you go. I had a cartoon for it. So people are really happy to hear comforting lies. There's a very short queue of people wanting to know unpleasant truths. But our job as evaluators is, if there are unpleasant truths, is to surface them and tell them like it is. And so we don't go in with a negative point of view. We should go with a neutral point of view. One of the things I love about being an evaluator is I just work on lots of different things. I work on rural electrification, rural roads, irrigation projects, watershed development projects, maternal and child health, education, anemia. Those are different topics I work on, and you bring a skill set from being an evaluator or an evidence synthesis specialist, and you learn about the content. So I go into, say, the rural electrification study, no strong priors whatsoever. If anything, a bit lefty, favour renewables. The time I wrote the report on that, I was talking about Bank, investment in renewables compared to just expanding the grid, it was a really bad idea. And a very controversial report saying, if you really want to help poor people, expand the grid. Forget about renewables for now. The cost for renewables has come down, so that statement's changed, but that was not the case at the time. So I go into areas without strong priors about what I'm going to find, because I don't know anything about the area. Where you work as subject expert, they already have pretty strong priors about what's going to work and what's not going to work. You need to work with sector subject expertise, but you need to also recognise that it has biases. Part of these biases come from who we speak to. So we speak to people like this. People speak to people like us. As someone who's worked on evaluation funded by foreign donors, we go and speak to people in our donor organisation and other donor organisations. We don't speak to this guy. Okay, so evaluators of education projects don't speak to teacher unions. Evaluators of health projects don't go and speak to frontline workers. Evaluators of policy initiatives don't speak to politicians. Evaluators key individuals, key social issues, say like child protection, don't speak to journalists who might be investigating these issues. Don't speak to, I've missed on this list, church leaders, for example, other people who are important in civil society. This is a key point about doing a good stakeholder analysis. So in a workshop, doing a piece of work I'll mention again later, and I made this point about you need a proper stakeholder mapping. And people who said, oh, stood up, we did a stakeholder mapping, and here it is. And who had they mapped? They'd mapped, it was in the Netherlands, other Dutch organisations working in that country, civil society organisations supported by the Dutch. That's a very incomplete stakeholder mapping. You've got to think outside the box, outside the diagram, to think about who's actually involved or affected by these interventions, who are the relevant actors in this space. And the most common thing is, oh, we'll go to the project start and get a list of people, key informants we should speak to. No. Okay, just don't do that, because it's going to strongly bias you in several directions. So think about a proper stakeholder mapping where you think about who these other people speak. And once you get one of these people, they'll tell you, oh, there's so and so and so and so and so and so. All would be people who are outside this box that you're thinking is a traditional evaluator speaking to just to the donor agencies and so on. Okay, I didn't just like so. I have an analogy about pushing the car, but I couldn't draw a car very well, so I had to do this instead. So in the pushing the car analogy is, one person can't push a car, 3 people can push a car. So when 3 people pushing a car, who's pushing the car? So in this not fantastic cartoon, you've got these 5 people holding up a heavy rock, and one person saying, "Look, I'm lifting up the rock." The other people are like, "You really?" And so there's 2 important issues here. One is, I mean, so people talk about quantitative and qualitative, which is fine, but they don't seem to understand the key distinction, which is explained brilliantly in an excellent book called Tale of Two Cultures by Gertz and White, not me, no relation, Gertz and White. And the key point is that quantitative, this is about causal evidence. Causal claims from quantitative studies are probabilistic statements. So percentage reduction in the chance of getting diarrhea for children with clean access to clean water. Whereas causal claims in qualitative data are about necessary and sufficient conditions. So each of these persons is necessary to lift the rock, but not one of them is sufficient. Maybe we could take 1 away, but we couldn't take 2 away. So you've got to think about necessary and sufficient conditions. This is not done because donors tend to look back to this framing question. Values tend to look just at the intervention being evaluated, ignore all other sources of support, ignore all other factors going on in society. So I worked back in the 1990s a lot on what was called structural adjustment programs, particularly in Africa, where the critics would say, "Oh, the World Bank is an IMF determining policy in African countries," and supporters of structural adjustment programs where they work, like in Ghana, would say, "Oh, the World Bank came in and gave policy advice on how to reform the economy." This is not true at all. The major studies on this, including one I did, but also other people, would say the major driver of policy change is domestic politics. Big surprise. So the statement from the left of the World Bank, "I'm telling countries what to do," it simply wasn't true. I need to think of the UK context, 1976. Well, most people remember that when the Wilson government invited in devalued the pound, and they invited in the IMF to basically to underwrite the package. They needed the foreign exchange, but it was really a case of scapegoating. The Wilson government wanted to say, "It wasn't us, the IMF made us do it," and it just wasn't true. These are policy changes that had to be instituted at that time because of the depth of the economic crisis they were facing. And then that's what you find in these studies of adjustment. But the example I will give was a more recent World Bank study of its support to the Philippines. And they look at its role in policy support. And there's been a smoking, what's called a sin tax. So a tax on smoking and drinking in the Philippines, and taking the money from that tax to subsidize health insurance. And it's mentioned in the World Bank Country Assistance Assessment as being the World Bank gave policy support and did research for the government of the Philippines to support this policy. This policy was basically done because the World Bank came in and gave its policy advice. And that's the way you'd read this report. Oh, the World Bank came in, gave policy advice, the government adopted it. Harvard have done a business case of this policy reform. It was Aquino, the president's idea, had a health minister who was a surgeon, but strongly in favor of preventive health, so he strongly backed the idea. Research was done by about a dozen organizations, particularly local research organizations supported by the Asia Foundation, did research around what the level of tax should be and so on, and how to work out the insurance mechanism, to link the tax mechanism to the insurance scheme and so on. And in that Harvard report, the World Bank is mentioned just once in that list of 11 organizations that did research that supported the government's position, but it was a domestically driven policy. And so the World Bank's that one guy holding up the rock saying, "Look at me, I'm doing it all by myself." Because in their own report, the World Bank, that's all you hear about. The World Bank did this work. It's just not true. These other guys were actually doing more of the work holding up the rock than was the World Bank. So I'm going to get back to my theme about monitoring data now, because I haven't mentioned it for a while. So back when I was a teenager, my father had this book, The Peter Principle. And not this exact copy, but it had the same cover as this one. And the Peter Principle is management consultancy, is that people get promoted to their level of incompetence. So if someone's very good as a teacher, they get promoted to be a head teacher, which requires a different skill set. They can't do a very good job. People who work on the shop floor get promoted into management positions. Again, might not be the same skill set. They're not very good at their jobs. Someone who's a good chief financial officer becomes the CEO. can't do that. It's different skill set required. So people get, the original Peter principle was people get promoted to a level of incompetence. And so you get organizations full of people who can't do their jobs very well. So organizations don't function very well. The evidence Peter principle is that evidence is used for something it's not suitable for. So monitoring data, monitoring is important. As a person run organizations, I always have a management information system, which is basically monitoring data. So I know what's going on in areas where things aren't going as planned, so I need to start paying attention to them to see if we can make things work better. But monitoring data shouldn't be used for evaluative judgments. You're promoting them to a level beyond what they're meant to be used for. Particularly, we shouldn't make causal claims based on subjective perceptions of interventions. You can use subjective perceptions for lots of things, but not causal claims, or again, monitoring data. And this is the curse of results frameworks. So results frameworks have become extremely common. Okay, and many organizations, particularly NGOs, have these results frameworks with this level called impact. And you can go to their websites and they say, how do we measure our impact? What's our impact? And it's based on the change in outcomes in the areas in which they're working. But there's so many factors affecting these outcomes, they cannot possibly attribute or contribute or whatever. They're changing that observed change in the outcomes to what they're doing. And particularly with missing beginnings and weakly articulated fears of change, inadequate methods designs, and so on, there's no way they can make proper causal claims. But most of them don't even go that far. They say, oh, here's our impact framework, here's our results framework, here's a change in our impact indicators. So here's our story about what impact we're having. It's just nonsense, frankly. So results agenda has been extremely damaging. So I have a paper on the 4 waves to end revolution and talks about the first wave being new public management when all this results stuff started. At the time, it was good for various reasons. But now it's gone too far. And agencies that learned, like USAID and DFID was, said, oh, we can't use results frameworks, we need to use impact evaluations to learn what difference our interventions make. And that's what people need to know. And then finally, global change based on single studies, which I've come to now, and I think it might be getting to the end. So a single study can tell you, oh, this worked here, this didn't work here, these were issues that arose in implementation here, or this particularly worked really well, was well designed, implemented program, try and scale that up in that way. But if you want to go globally and say, okay, what should you do in India? You can't just rely on one study in one district in Western Kenya, which I use that example because that is precisely Deworm the World. So Deworm the World is based on this one study in Western Kenya, which found a strong effect of school-based deworming on not just reducing the worm burden, on health, nutrition, education outcomes. And there are 3 studies in Africa which find positive effects of deworm programs. But Evidence Action, which is the sort of practitioner-run by IPA, and CIF, the Children Investment Fund Foundation, have been out promoting deworming as like the best buy in development. And here's from the Bihar, and Bihar has a state in India, Bihar deworm program saying evidence across the globe shows deworming leads to improvements in health, education, and long-term well-being. It is simply not true. So there's a Cochrane review, there's a Campbell review, and the Campbell reviews looked at 65 studies in 23 countries, over 1 million children, little or no proof of weight, stunting, school attendance, cognition, self-reported health, or mortality. No evidence on quality of life, and the bottom bit, and no indirect benefits were found, which is one of the claims for deworming people. So if you want to say what works globally, you need to do systematic reviews. You need to get all the available evidence, bodies of evidence, and read across those bodies of evidence. That's why systematic reviews are so important. So here are the 10 flaws. What is to be done? So I must admit, I've not thought about this one a whole lot. Hopefully people come with ideas on this or argue with me and that'll lead to better ideas. One is we just need to use evaluation standards. So if randomized control trials in medicine, something called the CONSULT guidelines, we talk about the conduct and reporting of RCTs in medicine. Back when I joined 3IE, one of our first staff members, 3IE, wrote a CONSULT adaptation for development interventions. We published it in Journal of Development Effectiveness. No take-up whatsoever. It was just too early. No one was ready for that. We're going back 15 years. Now the time is probably right. And if we do similar sets of standards, hopefully there'll be some take-up. We have an upcoming webinar. Hopefully someone from Campbell South Asia is on the line. I'll put it into Twitter or in the chat, a link, a webinar for the piece of work we did for the Dutch Foreign Ministry on a meta-evaluation of their evaluation support advocacy programs and reproductive health. And so the advocacy programs were largely small and impact evaluations, and we developed a critical appraisal tool for assessing how confident we are in study findings from those evaluations. And the critical appraisal tool can be turned around to be, okay, these are things you need to do to have a good study. So we've got a webinar coming up later this month presenting that. It's quite technical. It's around the critical appraisal tool for small and impact evaluations. So do look out for that. Evaluation design. Understand evaluation design has the three components: who you're going to collect data from, how you're going to collect those data, how you're going to analyze those data. And so the methods section, which I'd rather be called the evaluation design section, needs to have those three components. Explicit potential source of bias. What are the biases that might happen? Confirmation bias, respondent biases, who to speak to bias, and so on. And what are you going to do to overcome those, which is mainly about being systematic in your approaches down at primary level, using the same sort of systematic principles that we use in systematic reviews applied to research. Pre-registration. So having prior registration in your plan for the evaluation, a protocol for the evaluation, will help you basically avoid cherry picking. You said you're going to do this, you said you're going to report from these focus groups, well, please do it. End of measures of outcomes, that's a results framework. Outcomes do not tell you what happened in the absence of having a control group where you can compare outcomes between treatment and control. And we need to do capacity development. These flaws wouldn't be happening if funders were not willing to accept low quality evaluations, evidently they are, and evaluators would be not wanting to produce and get paid for low quality evaluations. I tend to want to avoid the word quality and talk about finding where studies where we have low confidence in their findings, because that can happen even though you've done your best, but often it is actually there's a question of poor quality. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Howard, for that really interesting talk, very comprehensive overview of different aspects of the evaluation, flaws in evaluation as well, so bringing us through them from the beginning of the process. And it's interesting because that missing beginnings bit that you began with is something that I've been dealing with in my current day job, as I work for a youth justice charity as the lead evaluator, and that's one of the things that I think is often missing is a really clear description of the intervention itself. So it was really interesting to see it right at the start. Questions coming through, and please do continue to and if you want to come in and say anything out loud, then please put your hand up and I'll try and come to you if I can, but if not, I'll read out the questions. One really good question from Sophie Wheeler. I'm not sure what organisation you're from. There is examples of really evaluations we actually read and learn from. Is there any that really come to mind for you in terms of good evaluations that we could hold up as an example to learn from as we write up our evaluative practice?
So I guess there's a bit, it got a bit broken. You're saying, can I give an example of a good evaluation?
So, you know of the high quality evaluations that are worth sort of reading through and learning from? Well, perhaps that's something that we could think about pulling together, so we could sort of look towards the way people write things up and conduct their work. Because there seems to be two issues here. There's the design and the actual carrying out of the evaluation, and then there's the writer of the evaluation, that are almost two separate issues that cause the flaws, as it were.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. So you're right in the last point. So that's why we distinguish between conduct and reporting. So standards are around conduct of evaluation and reporting of the evaluation. In terms of collecting some best practice, I think that might be controversial, but I think it's a good idea. So maybe we can get together and talk about that. We can invite nominations. Anyone in the chat's free to in the event free to send in a nomination for best practice evaluation. Doesn't mean you'll get picked. And I know some examples that I like. And there's because I do work on youth offending in the UK, didn't come up in this talk. There's the Youth Justice Board back in the early 2000s to commission a series of evaluations, and there's some particular one on sports, one on mentoring, particular one on mentoring, really just excellent evaluations. So I'm going to put them in the pile to be looked at when we do this, and we'll try and find from across the globe though examples of good evaluations. And I think mainly on the qualitative side. I mean, we can do it on the quantitative side as well, or maybe particularly mixed methods, because the problem with mixed method evaluations is you get often a good RCT, but authors struggle to actually try and think of a good way in which they can integrate the qualitative component. When I was at 3IE, we funded mixed method studies as being mixed methods, and it was just really hard to get them to meaningfully incorporate the two parts of the research design, evaluation design. So let's come back to that, and maybe we can even have a best practice webinar series, have something presented and so on as well. Yeah.
Yes, I think there's a lot that we can support with at UKES on that. Questions coming in around kind of methods and methodology. So sticking with the reporting questions for now. So John Newman has asked the use of the term method. So more of what counts as a method versus a methodology. So could a survey be called a data collection method an evaluation method? And a few people are also asking about this reporting process and what's appropriate. So early on, you talked about monitoring passing as evaluation. And I just wondered, maybe you could unpick that. Do you read an evaluation and think that's not an evaluation, that's a monitoring reporting process? And maybe you could tell us what the differences are.
Yeah, we're having difficulty hearing you, Kirsty. It's not only me, people are saying in the chat. Don't
Oh,
you get
I'm
a
so
headset or
sorry. I
something?
don't.
Yeah, you're pretty muted. But I got some of that, so I'll answer some stuff. And I read John's question. So there's absolutely, you could refer to the survey's data collection method, because that's what it is. It's not an evaluation. It's not an evaluation method. And my point about preferring the term evaluation design was I thought you can then break it down to these three components: two related to data collection, data collection analysis, and one related to the analysis of those data. But data collection method for the survey is perfectly fine. Focus groups, whatever, all valid methods of data collection. So no problem with that. On the monitoring aspect, so we talk about monitoring and evaluation, M&E, and what you see is that the vast number of people involved in M&E as M&E officers in organisations are much more involved in monitoring than evaluation. And that's become more the case with the move to results frameworks, because their job becomes monitoring results across the results framework, which goes from inputs through to so-called impact. And they don't have any time left for proper evaluation, and they're not asked to do it because the managers think that the impact level of the results framework is telling them what impact they're having. So, I mean, so if you go back to my quite a whole paper now, 15 years on, so contribution to current-based impact evaluation, I say there's two meanings of the word impact, and it's caused a lot of confusion. So one is the impact in terms of you've got a log frame, and at the top you've got inputs, activities, outputs, intermediate outcomes, final outcomes, impact. And the other is impact evaluation in terms of what difference intervention make compared to with versus without. And those two get conflated. So people say impact evaluation when they're talking about looking at these high level indicators, which is why I don't use the word impact for an indicator. I don't talk about impact indicators because it confuses the two terms. And so monitoring, including impact indicators, is just monitoring. It's just telling what happened. It's a factual statement of what happened. You want to about impact in terms of what difference the program made, you need a counterfactual statement, which in large end designs uses a comparison group, in small end designs uses some causal reasoning based on a theory of change. And I've nothing against using small end designs where appropriate. We're supported by some values design like contribution analysis or process tracing. And there's been a lot of developments since I wrote my small end paper 10 years ago or so on particularly process tracing. But you can't just do the monitoring alone. I think that's an evaluation. And someone asked about, can we just counting outputs and activities? Just counting activities and outputs, saying how many people were trained and so on, not an evaluation. I mean, it's partly accountability. It's partly, well, you said you were going to train this many people, and we did. So that's good to know. It's some sort of accountability there. But actually, evaluations is more than that. It's more than just counting the numbers. It is trying to know about what actually happened or not, why things happened or didn't happen, if it made a difference, and so on. We're asking, maybe, Kirsten, because we can't hear you, do you want to let people speak instead?
We're still struggling to hear me now if I lean forward, or
Yeah, it's better at the moment, yes.
okay. If I'm happy to let people speak if they'd like to speak up, pop your hands up. I was apologise for the difficulties in hearing me. I'll try and address that for the next session that we have. Lots of people are asking questions, Howard, about complexity. And how we tackle issues and complexity. So there's two questions that have come up in the chat on it, and if anyone wants to come in on it, pop your hand up. This is around the fact that there are often a series of interventions that are often applied differently in different situations. And then someone else has suggested, I think it's Emma Williams has suggested, that maybe social evaluations might want to focus more on learning rather than attributing impact and outcomes to interventions. And I wondered what you thought about that side of things, when you've got these really complex interventions with many different aspects going on, and potentially quite a lot of other players in the field potentially having an impact as well, like your rock analogy that you used.
Okay, there's quite a lot of questions. Yes, I want to not speak for the next half hour, so I'll just try and break it down a bit. I dislike the word complexity. I think it's used as a smokescreen or a mirror to get away with not doing work in which we can have high confidence. So I'm not denying that complexity exists. And so people criticize, say, a lot of studies about having a linear approach. And this, again, it goes back to my old paper. This word linear is often misused because it has very precise meaning. And what they actually mean is that you're being too positivist. You think like this happened definitely to that, and we don't ever think that. I'll come back to that. A related concept is around transferability of study findings. So a really hardcore constructivist would say you can never transfer study findings from one setting to another. Now, they're two separate terms, generalizability and transferability. I think it's useful to distinguish them. So generalizability means this is always true everywhere, all around the world. Like you let go of a book on Apple and it drops to the ground, and unless you're in a vacuum. And that's sort of generalizable, universally true statement. And there's some generalizable facts about humans, like the importance of the first 1,000 days in a child's development. So a child needs adequate nutrition and cognitive stimulation in those first 1,000 days, otherwise they suffer irreversible damage in their cognitive development. So they'll be permanently stupid. You can't do anything about it. Okay, so interventions that improve nutrition or cognitive or child stimulation in the first 1,000 days will make a difference. But of course, you've then got that behavioural link about, oh, well, will the parents do what they're being recommended to do through the intervention? And once you get a behavioural link, then of course you can't make statements of any certainty, and there may be limited transferability. Transferability means, well, it worked here, does it work in another setting? But I think the limits of transferability are overstated. And the example I give from Nems map we did is on road safety. So 80% or more of fatalities and road traffic injuries take place in developing countries. Over 90% of studies on intervention to reduce road accidents take place in North America. And so the evidence doesn't come from where the evidence is needed. Is North America transferable or not transferable? To an extent it is, because there are certain risk factors in driving, being dark, being drunk, speeding, which are risk factors all around the world. So interventions that successfully taking care of those things actually will work anywhere. But otherwise, road pattern uses vary greatly in developing countries compared to developed countries. In developed countries, most traffic fatalities and injuries are passengers and drivers. In developing countries, there are other road users. But the engineering is being done is on internal car design to reduce accidents, people inside the car. It's not on front end engineering to reduce the impact of people get hit by the car, because that would be relevant evidence for Bringer, for example. So you can clearly say, oh, that's transferable, that's not transferable. You're doing the wrong sort of studies for the Indian context, for example. So transferability, you can often figure it out. Or that there's a well-known. So I will stop talking in a minute. There's a well-known review that was done some years ago of saying, are there any randomized controlled trials of using parachutes when you jump from a plane? And so there are no randomized controlled trials of using parachutes, so we can't conclude if it's a good idea to use parachutes or not. It was obviously a tongue-in-cheek review. Then someone did a randomized controlled trial using parachutes. But the plane they jumped from was a small plane on the ground. So they jumped like 4 feet out of the plane. And he concluded there was no difference in trauma from wearing a parachute or not wearing a parachute, but then said this finding may not be transferable to planes flying at 20,000 feet. Yes, it's transferability is obvious. So back to complexity. So the whole point about modeling, and again, I've started my life as a macroeconometric modeler. The whole point about modeling is you abstract from reality to capture the key parts of relationships. So we see these series of change diagrams that have like 100 bubbles and 2,000 little arrows, and like they're no use to anyone. Okay, the economist Joan Robinson said a map of a scale of a model that tries to reproduce reality is as useful as a map on a scale of 1 to 1. The point is a model doesn't try to reproduce reality, it tries to capture the key causal relationships. If you think the intervention is worth doing, you must think it's going to change something. Yes, why are you doing it otherwise? So we should have some idea about how we want this intervention to work, basically. And there are key things about if an intervention is going to work, people involved need to know about it, they need to take part in it, they need to understand what their role is. And these are common findings. People don't know, don't take part, they do the wrong thing. And so you can cut through complexity. And I've never seen a case where I felt, oh, it's just too complex, you can't evaluate it.
Thank you. Hopefully I'm solving my sound issues now. So jump in, Howard, if I go out. There's quite a lot of questions, and this kind of relates to the complexity. There's quite a lot of questions that relate to sort of issues or restrictions around funding. It kind of relates to stakeholders as well. And somebody has asked the question, is poor evaluation better than no evaluation? And I'd be interested in your thoughts there. Also on question of the role of commissioners in potentially getting proposals that I think someone's turn of phrase was promise the world but don't have the budget or method. Also, in the talk of funders and want out of an evaluation and then their likelihood to continue funding and how that might restrict you. To go a little bit further in talking about how that impacts the types of flaws we see, but also how we might get around that issue and improve and reduce the number of flaws that we're seeing.
So all of these are ethical issues. So ethics and evaluation is an underappreciated course. Look at many textbooks on evaluation that don't have a chapter on ethics. That's changing. Certainly in randomized controlled trials, ethics was restricted to basically human subject approval. So you're going to collect data from human beings. Do they agree? Do you get consent form? And ethics goes much beyond that. So if the funder tells you, oh, you have to go and collect data from these particular villages, we're going to speak to these stakes, we can't speak to those, that's an ethical issue. And you have to tell the funder, no, you're restricting the validity of the evaluation by those restrictions. We should take a random sample of communities, or no, I need to speak to these stakeholders. if they insist on the budget restriction, you can say, okay, but we need to write this up in the report that we had these restrictions imposed on us. And at a certain point, you need to be able to walk away if they're not willing to actually go along with what would be a credible evaluation, and say, people will know, will get to know which commissioners are not willing to have commission credible evaluations. There's this same issue around is no evaluation better than a poor evaluation? And at a certain point, yes, that's true. You've got and it links to the promise of the world thing. You see this all the time. It really annoys me. It particularly annoys me when you're bidding for work and people are going to put in bids where they say they're going to do things they can't possibly do and win the contract, and then they get contract extensions or additional money or whatever, and because it wasn't possible to do. We're normally honest. We say we can't do what you're asking in that time or money available. We can just do this. And sometimes funds appreciate that and you might get the work, but normally not, to be honest. And so this does come back to it's important for commissioner evaluations to have someone who understands sufficient amount of evaluation to be a good commissioner, and that's often lacking. So back when I worked at the World Bank and impact evaluations were just starting up, and something I got asked a lot was different bilateral agencies, different European governments asking me, we want to start doing impact evaluations, what should we do? And I'd always say, hire someone that understands impact evaluation to be in your staff, because you can't commission impact evaluations unless you have that person. Because otherwise, you've got these, like the usual suspect consultancies. They can copy and paste enough to put a credible proposal together, but they can't do the work. Yeah, when something goes wrong, which always does happen with an RCT, more or less, they won't be able to adapt, and they won't be able to do any sort of useful analysis anyway. So you've got to have someone in-house who both can do that, but also, when I ran 3IE, we had a lot of what I call supplier driven or researcher capture, where researchers would go off and just do a study of interest to them to test their own esoteric pet theories, not answer the main evaluation questions. That's again an ethical issue. So you've got to really answer the questions of interest to the commissioner. And if you can't answer those questions with confidence, you have to, one, be clear about the limitations, and two, say it's not worth doing that, what you're asking, because it won't give a sufficiently credible answer. We're in this space with reviews because everyone loves rapid reviews because they're cheaper and they're quicker, but they're just not as good as full systematic reviews. What FCDO, I don't know if FCDO is on the call, what FCDO are currently doing are commission what they call rapid reviews. They then ask you to do a full systematic review just for less money and less time. So they call it a rapid review, but what they ask for is actually a full systematic review. So I have some other points on that, but I think that the main point there is ethics should be much more broadly conceived than just like getting consent from participants. It is around all these questions about doing a quality evaluation is an ethical issue.
Thanks, Harold. We've got about 5 minutes left, so we'll ask one or two more questions before we wrap up. And I think you've talked about, there's quite a few questions around sort of method and I may pronounce your name incorrectly. I'm basing that on how I pronounce my name. Around moving setting or requesting critical evaluations, and I think this may also be relevant to the question around funders or commissioners, but also small charities, asking about how to sort of stakeholders in what is appropriate methodology, but also accepting findings that might not fit with them biases about how their interventions work and the type of impact it happens. What can we do to encourage the use of evaluation, given that might be the outcome? Hopefully I've summarised people's questions well there.
Can you say that? I didn't get what the question was. Sorry, I'm struggling. I'm looking for it at the same time. I got to be asking. No, go. Start again.
How can you move organisations towards accepting critical evaluations? I've just tweaked someone's question slightly. So governments in particular, how can you encourage organisations to conduct evaluations? The outcomes and findings might not be what they want.
Okay, so I'm picking up another question I also saw. I think you might have said about small evaluations.
Mm.
So many years ago, in the industry, i.e., I was asked by what's it called? I have my name now. The US equivalent of Bond, which is the umbrella body for development NGOs in the UK. The US equivalent of Bond asked me to go and speak about impact evaluation to their annual conference, where you've got big NGOs like Save the Children, CARE, and so on, who at the time were pretty much resisting doing rigorous impact evaluations. And I went there, having been to our office, our main office in 3 days in Delhi, been in the office in Delhi, and in Delhi, in the office then, the tea lady in our office in Delhi had her own NGO. And I'd been an earlier weekend, a couple of weeks before I went to the US, to visit her NGO. So it had an annual budget of like $7,000, something like that. She collected money locally in part of Delhi where she lived, and she used the money to pay for a doctor and a nurse to go and do immunization in slum communities in Delhi. And she had what she called her evaluation system, which was monitoring, where she had a list of all the people that had been immunized and how many people had been immunized on particular days, and they also just collected clothing and blankets and distributed those. She had a list of all the stuff collected where it's from, and so it was a really nice system, very appropriate to someone whose annual budget is $7,000. You're then talking to NGOs that had annual budgets of $700 million, who had no better evaluation system than she had. Okay, even though they had PhDs, many staff, and so on, they couldn't do more than count outputs and outcomes. And so these and many of these organisations, yes, of course, you cut your coat according to your cloth. So her cloth was really quite small, but she had something appropriate to her purposes. But these larger NGOs, they've got no excuse whatsoever for not engaging in a proper impact evaluation agenda, and they have not all done so. And my real bet now is the Global Partnership for Education (GPE), which has literally billions of dollars and does really poor quality work in supporting the evidence architecture and evidence agenda in general. What you need to come back onto use evidence, there's something called the 80% rule. The 80% of programs don't work. They have small or no effects. The problem is with process evaluations, so like the World Bank performance system, 80% of projects are satisfactory. So when you do more qualitative-oriented approaches, so 80% of things are working, but actually when you do impact evaluation, 80% of things don't work, they don't deliver. So problem is that the public sector in general and development programs have no bottom line. So so they don't go bust like a private company would if it don't work. So impact evaluation has to serve as that bottom line, and we have to say this is not working. Okay, so they should not be happy to the fact that 80% of their money is going on things that don't work. And people funding those programs should not be happy. 80% of my money. If I give £1 to UNICEF, 80% of that, 80% of that goes on, it's not going to make any difference. Okay, that's not okay. All right, so we need to get pressure going from champions, both inside and outside the organisation, saying no, we need to know what works. And you have to then have a culture that accepts failure, a culture of learning. So what should be penalised is not failure, but the failure to learn from failure. So we don't want to say, oh, your project failed, you're bad, you got to make one promoted. No, hey, look, I failed. We learned a lot from that. We know what not to do. We can get out of the 80% and be in the 20% that work. I mean, the more, it's back to an ethical issue. The more ethical case for doing good quality evaluations is watertight. And it's funders just are not, just funders and managers, they're living in this bubble, and they just we do what we always did. It must work. We've always done it. No, it's not true.
Thank you, Howard. And I think that was an excellent way to finish, an excellent message to finish the Q&A on. We're going on 1:15, which is when we'd finish. So it was a really interesting talk. I apologise for my sound issues, but we heard you very well, Howard. And thank you to the Global Development Network and to everybody for joining the call. And the UK Evaluation Society and the Global Development Networks. We're both on LinkedIn, Twitter, and have a website. So please do be a member and do come along to these again. Really interesting talk. And thank you to Howard and your team for setting this call up.
Thank you everyone for joining. Tell your friends and family, bring your pets along next time, and we'll see you then.
All right, bye now.
Bye
Thanks,
bye.
everyone.
Bye.